At Turning Point USA's 2019 Student Action Summit, we sit down with Gregg Jarrett, a legal and political analyst for the Fox News channel and author of The Russia Hoax and Witch Hunt. We discuss his in-depth investigation into the Spygate scandal, as well as the impeachment of President Trump. Gregg Jarrett, really good to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, great to be with you.
So Gregg, you're the author of Witch Hunt, the greatest mass delusion in American political history. If I recall, that's
right.
It
is.
That's the subtitle.
That's the subtitle. And it pretty much tells the story. I mean, it is amazing to me how a small group of unelected officials in government operating in the shadows of secrecy managed to convince tens of millions of Americans that the president was a traitor and a Russian asset, which was utterly ludicrous.
There's still people that believe that. If you look on Twitter and so forth.
Thanks to a complicit media that were witting accessories to the Russia hoax and the ensuing witch hunt. You know, and it was based largely on this phony dossier of disinformation and misinformation. And now the Inspector General has come out with a report that says the FBI found out almost 3 years ago that it was based on a subsource, a Russian, who confessed that it was all just largely made up, multiple hearsay upon hearsay, a lot of it said in jest. And they asked the subsource, well, did you corroborate any of it? And he said, zero, nothing. And so think about that. A couple of guys make stuff up, and it holds a nation and a presidency hostage for almost 3 years. That should never happen in America.
No, and it's really interesting. If there was ever, you know, a body of work that thoroughly debunked the Steele dossier that we've been discussing, it's this IG report. But it isn't being pitched that way among many media.
No, the media is still in denial. Now, you have to keep in mind that the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, is really nothing more than a glorified auditor and stenographer. He talks to people, and in his report, he regurgitates what they tell him. He looks at documents and summarizes them. He doesn't have the authority to bring criminal charges, to compel witnesses, to convene a grand jury. And so he simply lays out his findings. But the findings were stunning. You know, the media does acknowledge, oh yes, 17 errors and omissions by the FBI. No, actually, it's 51. If you go to appendix number 1, it lays out a chart of all of the inaccurate statements, deceptions, concealing of exculpatory evidence, the outright lies of the FBI, 51 of them, and all of them going in the same direction against Donald Trump. I mean, that is evidence of bias. It was purposeful, it was intentional, it was deliberate. And insofar as one of the top FBI lawyers who doctored evidence in support of the FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign and Carter Page. I mean, in my judgment, that's criminal.
Right, and it's very interesting because Kleinsmith, which is of course who you're talking about here, again, when I look in the media, and he hasn't been portrayed as like someone who actually led the Crossfire Hurricane investigation for a while. Right. He's being portrayed as...
They minimize it.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, that speaks volumes of the media. You know, the media in the Russia hoax and the witch hunt really, and I write an entire chapter of this, second longest chapter, 54 pages, filled with examples of how the media got it wrong. They engaged in grossly reckless journalism, media malpractice on steroids, and to some extent they're still doing it.
You know, we just learned, as a little aside yesterday, that Wikipedia will no longer use Epoch Times as a source because of our reporting around Spygate and these things, right? Because it's Spygate, it's labeled as a conspiracy theory on Wikipedia. Isn't that just an amazing?
Yeah, it is amazing. They're picking and choosing winners and losers driven by their own bias. You know, it was hatred and bias that blinded the media to the real story that they missed. And that is that it was actually, you know, a pernicious lie and a hoax. You know, people tend to forget that there are no witches in a witch hunt, but this obsessive, irrational desire to believe that something exists is what drives, you know, a witch hunt. Trump was the target of the hunt, and people went after him in government, outside of government, private actors in the media, with a vengeance. You know, the media was so quick to accept as gospel the many intelligence leaks that they willingly accepted without ever corroborating or verifying the information itself. And they accepted as scripture the dossier as if it were the truth. Even this year in 2019, CNN, just before the Mueller report came out, published a story online saying the dossier is mostly true.
Right.
And of course now we know it wasn't.
Right. You know, another thing that just comes to mind, because this issue is, of course, you know, hot in my mind, is Congressman Nunes, you know, head of the Intelligence Committee at the time, the House Intelligence Committee. He published the Nunes memo, and there was kind of a level of furor around the concept that that might be declassified. This was, of course, you know, it's a very short 4-page memo that describes the FISA abuse, right?
Yeah, I mean, the media in particular were apoplectic. How dare you release information that's classified that will jeopardize sources and methods, and of course none of it did, which is an odd juxtaposition for the media. They should want information to be revealed, classified or not. But it just demonstrates their bias against Trump, Devin, Nunes, Republicans.
My own take, and I'd love to hear yours, is when, you know, the Nunes memo, you know, I believe, you know, completely vindicated through, of course, through the IG report.
Yes.
But it's almost like if you read that, those 4 pages, you get a lot of the picture of those 400 or 500 pages.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
You know, the Nunes memo was 100% correct. The Schiff memo was about 90% wrong. The only thing that was accurate in the Schiff memo was the signature line, Adam Schiff. That was about, you know, signing his name was about the only thing that was accurate in it. And yet, I remember one story in particular entitled, "The Dossier is More Reliable and Truthful Than the Nunes Memo." That's the media that made that judgment call, and 100% wrong. One of the amazing things is the New York Times and the Washington Post received a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting, their intensive reporting on the dossier, which turns out to have been false and largely a hoax.
Do you think they're going to retract that Pulitzer?
You know, with an apology they should, and an admission that, gosh, we missed the biggest story of all, that it was untrue and a hoax.
We've been covering the IG report, doing some really deep dives. We had Jeff Carlson, one of our, you know, sort of people that
he wrote some very good pieces on this. He was an excellent reporter on this.
Yeah, and I think you actually cite him.
I do.
And some of our others in your book. I want to move to the statements by Barr and Durham that accompanied the report itself, and then just kind of where you see things coming from or going from here.
You know, it's abundantly clear that Durham and Barr have far greater access to evidence than the Inspector General, who again, you know, is sort of a auditor stenographer. John Durham, the U.S. Attorney specially appointed to investigate, this matter, has really unfettered authority as a prosecutor. He can convene a grand jury, he can compel witnesses through subpoenas, he can bring criminal charges, and he has the ability, unlike the Inspector General, to talk to actors in the intelligence community, which the IG never could do.
Right.
And they're a part of all of this. The Inspector General doesn't have the ability to talk to people outside the Department of Justice and FBI.
Right.
So it's pretty clear to me, Durham, having evolved his investigation from administrative now to a criminal probe, likely already has some compelling evidence of corruption and lawlessness.
What did you make of their statements that accompanied the IG report? And they were kind of like instant, if I recall, like almost.
They both said, we don't agree with the Inspector General's conclusion that the initiation of the Trump-Russia collusion probe by the FBI, July 31st, 2016, was properly predicated. It makes no sense. There was no credible evidence that Trump was conspiring with Russia. You know, to open a formal FBI investigation, you have to have two things. One, a reasonable basis to believe that a crime has been committed, and number two, specific articulable facts in support of that. They had neither. They had George Papadopoulos hearing a rumor that the Russians had Hillary Clinton's email.
Right.
So what? It's not a crime to hear a rumor. And by the way, that rumor was pervasive in the media and political circles at the time. So that wasn't, if Papadopoulos was the reason, as the FBI claims, for opening the investigation, it was done so wrongfully. And that may be what the Inspector General, or the Attorney General, I should say, is referring to.
This is an area of confusion, perhaps, even for me, I suppose, because I think in the IG report, he says he did. I don't think he says there was proper predication. Definitely doesn't say that. But he says the bar for starting the investigation essentially is really, really low.
He's wrong.
Right. Okay.
It's actually quite high. If you read the Department of Justice and the FBI guidelines and regulations, the FBI, it's called the DIOG, which is an acronym. I cite it extensively in my book. I lay out what you have to open an investigation. And it's very specific, and it's a high bar. And it was not sustained by any means, certainly not with Papadopoulos.
Right.
If it was the dossier, which I suspect was the real reason, that wasn't sufficient either, because they hadn't corroborated or verified any of the information. You can't simply rely on a supposed source who's really not a source at all. He's a purveyor of multiple hearsay information from anonymous sources. That's not good enough under the FBI standards to open a formal investigation. Preliminary, yes, but no, they opened a formal investigation on July 31st, 2016 without a sufficient legal basis. And I think that's what the Attorney General and John Durham are scrutinizing.
I see. So one more little bit about the investigation. How long do you think we're going to be waiting?
Months. My colleague Martha McCallum interviewed the Attorney General, and he indicated several months. I would imagine 6-7 months, so well into 2020. But I think there's a sense of urgency, and Attorney General Barr indicated that. But, John Durham has expanded his probe. He has added personnel. So I have a fair amount of confidence that he'll eventually get to the bottom of it. Most recently, we have learned through reporting that Durham wants to access ex-CIA Director John Brennan's communication, his records. Because as I describe Brennan in my book, he was the instigator of the hoax. He's the one who created the interagency task force that formed the basis for the FBI's Trump-Russia investigation. He was involved in spreading information to Capitol Hill and in turn to the media.
Very interesting. So we'll have to jump into the book I haven't read it yet, but what else will we find in there?
Well, there are a total of 9 chapters. All of them are self-sustaining chapters. I open comparing the FBI's handling of the Trump case with the Hillary Clinton case. It's entitled A Tale of Two Cases. And the disparate handling by people like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. Their text message revealed they adored the woman they were investigating and cleared, and disparaging, profanity-laced text messages about Trump, the man they later investigated. I mean, that tells you the bias that infected both investigations. There's a chapter about lying and spying, the FISA warrant, the attempted coup, Rod Rosenstein's aborted plan to secretly wear a wire and tape record the president and try to recruit cabinet members to evict the president from office. And I tell the story about how Rosenstein boards Air Force One and is asked by the president, confronted by the president about what he did, and how it appears that Rosenstein lied to the president about it all. So those are some of the chapters. Chapter 5 is entitled The Folly of Mueller's Magnum Opus, which pretty much tells the story. I dissect and deconstruct Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Mueller's report. Obstruction of justice had no application in the law, and I explained why.
Interesting.
And then the chapter on, the media witch hunt. There's also a chapter that I really try to emphasize that it's called Clinton Collusion. The media paid no attention to what Hillary Clinton did in paying for the dossier, her campaign and the DNC, and devoted all of their scrutiny to what Donald Trump didn't do. And so that's the focus of one of the chapters.
Fascinating. We have to talk a little bit about this. We just finished with an impeachment in the House, right? And I think it was during the time that the president was at a rally.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And then a few days afterwards, I think he was invited by Speaker Pelosi to give the State of the Union. The whole thing is kind of it's a crazy world we live in.
The only abuse of power is by Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, Nancy Pelosi, and Democrats in Congress. They spent all of their time talking about bribery, extortion, campaign finance. When they devised their 2 articles of impeachment, no crime is stated therein.
Right.
There's no treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. Instead, they have embraced this wonderfully amorphous term, abuse of power, which is nowhere in the Constitution, but very similar to what the framers rejected. They debated maladministration, which is almost identical to abuse of power. And they determined that it was too vague and ambiguous and broad. It would be weaponized for political reasons. And that's precisely what the framers feared, which is why in their wisdom, they instituted in the Constitution a safeguard, a procedural protection, which is a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate to actually remove the president.
Very interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So where do you think things are going to go next based on all this research that you've been doing?
Well, it's an interesting conundrum right now. Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to convey the articles of impeachment to the Senate. In fact, the Constitution's silent about that, so you can interpret it many ways. The Senate could take it up without conveyance, or they could simply say, we're paying no attention to this until you convey it to the United States Senate. What's outrageous is that Nancy Pelosi seems to think that she has some say. She can dictate the course and nature of the trial in the U.S. Senate. She has no business doing that. Just as the Senate didn't interfere with the House can't interfere in the Senate. The Constitution is very clear. The Senate has the sole power to try all impeachments. It doesn't say with the consent and approval of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. It doesn't say that.
Right. Again, very interesting. Is this all, like, I mean, from all sides now, political maneuvering? Like,
well, it was political from the beginning, and even Pelosi admitted it when she was caught on camera in a forum saying we've been trying to do this for 2.5 years. So think about that. She doesn't care whether there's a proper basis for impeaching and removing the President of the United States. She wanted to do it because she doesn't like the man, she doesn't like his policies, she doesn't like his politics. Again, that's precisely what the framers feared. In Federalist 65, Alexander Hamilton explains what they intended by impeachment. And he explained the fear of the framers that an opposing party would seek to remove a president for purely political reasons. And that's precisely what Nancy Pelosi and many Democrats are trying to do. I'll say parenthetically that the absolute worst person you could put in charge of impeachment in the House is Adam Schiff. And I think he has...
Why do you say that? Yeah.
I think he has diminished the credibility because of his many lies and deceptions, which I identify in the book. I mean, he lied about Bruce Orr, he lied about Christopher Steele, Schiff lied about the dossier, he lied about collusion evidence he claimed to have, which he didn't have.
Right,
and then, of course, he lied about his contacts with a whistleblower, who, by the way, under the law, is not a whistleblower at all, and is entitled to absolutely no identity protection and anonymity.
How is it that even the Intelligence Committee became involved in this in the first place?
I think after Jerry Nadler bungled the Mueller hearing, Nancy Pelosi decided she needed somebody else to be the face of impeachment, and she chose Adam Schiff. Again, the absolute worst person you could have as the face of Democrat impeachment.
Well, we saw, I mean, I think multiple polls subsequently showed only, sort of support for the president rising as a result of this impeachment process.
Oh, yeah. The president's poll numbers have only gone up. He's now leading in 3 of the main battleground swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Record fundraising.
That's right, against the impeachment. That's very interesting.
His approval rating has gone up. The USA Today poll has him leading all Democratic contenders. The CNN poll, not necessarily so, but his numbers jumping up by 5-6 points. So, Americans have a keen sense of fairness. And they realize that what the Democrats did in rushing through this impeachment, they realize it was really driven by rage and not reason. There's no clear and convincing evidence of an impeachable offense. A guy came up to me in a train station not long ago, and he said, I read the transcript of the president's conversation with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. He said, can you tell me what's wrong with it? And that's the problem. Most Americans look at the conversation and say, what's wrong with that? Is that really an impeachable offense? Especially when you compare it to Joe Biden's bragging about his quid pro quo, withholding $1 billion in exchange for the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor who happened to be investigating his son's company. If the president has a reasonable belief that a potential corrupt act has been committed by a public office holder, Vice President of the United States. He has every right to ask that foreign company to provide information.
And that's irrespective whether it's in his political interest or not? I guess that's the question, right? That's sort of hanging in the air.
You don't get immunity or amnesty simply because you're running for President of the United States. And so, you know, if it were otherwise, everybody charged with a federal crime could announce their candidacy for President of the United States. So, you know, I think there has been an automatic assumption on the part of Democrats, and this is in their articles of impeachment, that the president did this for personal gain to influence the upcoming election. It's nowhere in the transcript. And the president has said he was concerned about what Joe Biden was doing. So that speaks for itself.
Well, Gregg Jarrett, such a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, Jan. Thanks for having me.